Over the next half an hour or so, I'm going to take you through some of the major challenges in psychiatry. Professor Mai has already talked about some of the risk factors, and he mentioned specifically war, displacement, and also exposure to violence. So what I'm going to do is highlight some of the issues, and particularly in the context of the experience of United Kingdom. You in Italy have a major problem with all the migration that is happening, and I think it also not only offers a kind of social understanding of what's going on, but is also a good opportunity for further research. We know what a migrant is: somebody who changes their place of residence for any purpose, for any period of time. There are legal classifications particularly related to being a refugee and an asylum seeker. I'm going to talk a bit of characteristics of migration, and obviously motivation for migration can be a major stressor or a protective factor. And we know that there are any number of occupations which migrate regularly: anthropologists, diplomats, people who go for higher education, journalists, those who are in military service, missionaries, etc. And you can imagine that their experiences of migration are going to be very, very different from those of Syrian refugees or Libyan refugees who are migrating to Europe. But it's also worth bearing in mind, and again Professor Mai talked about urbanization, and that internal migration can create problems, particularly from rural to urban areas, but equally from urban to rural areas. And obviously there are many reasons for migration. People are exiled for political reasons. They may decide to migrate for economic reasons, either for business on a transient basis or on a permanent basis. And then there would be students who migrate for a short while or long term, and then film stars and pop stars who migrate regularly. So if you are Madonna or George Clooney and you have a villa in Italy and a chateau in Switzerland, a chateau in France, and beach house in Malibu, the stress related to migration is going to be very, very different. And obviously demographics of migrants are very important in terms of adjustment, and particularly if you're a primary migrant or secondary migrant. If you're a primary migrant, then the stress would be much more and very different, and obviously whether it is voluntary or forced. So there have been arguments for a long time, and what is it that predisposes people to migrate? Migration has been going on for thousands of years. It's nothing new, but the patterns change. And I'll come back to that because it's, particularly in the UK context, is critical to look at Asian experiences versus African Caribbean experiences. And we also know people react to migration in very different ways. Some people become very enthusiastic about migration, become very over-accepting, deny any difficulties, and are actively critical of the culture they have left behind or the culture they moved to. John Barry has written extensively about acculturation and adjustment and reaction and withdrawal. And I want us to remember that there are three kinds of experiences. There is the acculturation, and which may lead to culture conflict, either within the same culture or with the larger culture. There may be cultural bereavement, which is that you've left your culture behind and you're trying to adjust to the new culture and what that means. And lastly, it's about culture shock, that you move from one culture to another and you don't know what you're faced with and what experiences you may have. So you may actually withdraw rather than being part of the larger society. And there are very clear stages: pre-migration, migration, and post-migration. And it's not always easy to make clear distinctions, because migration, post-migration can be fairly similar, and people can prepare for it as a life event, and then subsequent adjustment, and then generational migration may not see that as a life event. Some of the changes associated with migration are about communication, because you have to learn a very different language. And I have been in the UK now for 34, 35 years. But about 7 or 8 years ago, somebody in the Royal College of Psychiatrists actually told me that I could not speak English. And what was I going to do about it? Now, 27 years after migration, if somebody is telling me that I don't know the language, is it my problem or is it their problem? And I think that's part of the challenge in terms of adjustment and acculturation that we need to think about. And obviously social support changes, vocational changes occur, and social roles, and there are legal implications. We know the factors responsible for distress, and I'll come back to those, but there's also a kind of, anthropologically, there is a general typology which looks at policy, whether you're forced, whether you're free migration, what does that do to your aspirations and social momentum, whether you migrate by yourself or with others. And we all know Odegaard's study in 1932, where he looked at schizophrenia in Norwegians in the United States with 1,067 individuals and 1,995 individuals in Norway, and showed that Norwegians in the United States showed 30 to 50% higher incidence of psychiatric morbidity, and that was 90 plus years ago. And what gets forgotten is these two findings, that only 11% presented within 2 years of migration, and nearly half presented after they had been in the country for 10 years or more. And I think that's quite a significant observation, and we need to bear that in mind. I don't want you to go through the table, but just as a comparison of UK African Caribbean immigrants and white natives, and I just want you to focus on this. The ratio of schizophrenia in UK African Caribbeans varies from about 2.8 in women in all over England and Wales to 4.9, and then it sort of goes completely unbelievable 7 times higher in Nottingham in 1988. We found fairly low rates at that time, but it also consistently, the ratio has been fairly high, no matter whether you use case notes, hospital admissions, or own clinical diagnosis. So what that has meant is that, are we looking at, when we talk about rates in migration, are we looking at first generation migrants or second generation migrants? And again, that's a difference that we need to be aware of. It's quite clear that among immigrants, rates are high. From 1960s onwards, and I'll come back to these, but even when you refine the rates, 1991, 94, 93, 96, 2001 and beyond. These have been 2 studies, etiology of social factors in psychosis, East London first episode studies, where they made consensus diagnosis with prospective case findings, well-defined geographical areas, separated white British from non-British whites, And again, I think one of the issues when we're looking at the rates, we need to bear in mind is the question of definitions. Who is a migrant? People are born in a country and they're called second-generation migrants or third-generation migrants. Is that a fair term? Also, when you compare white, which is a skin color, with ethnicity, which is African Caribbean, which derives from nationality, comparisons become a problem. And again, from a research perspective, we need to be very careful about that. It's consistently, these are the rates, and black African higher, black Caribbean even higher, Asians are marginally higher. And similar findings emerge, particularly mixed ethnicity starts to go up. Now, that again raises questions. Is it genetic? Is it social? Is it biological? What's going on? And same in the first episode study about 7 years ago, mixed white and black Caribbean rates are nearly 2 times those of Indians, and mixed other about 5 times. And age, sex, and social economic status again shows there are very clear differences. Mixed white and black Caribbean show higher rates. Now, what is it? That if you are in a mixed race relationship, does that really mean that your children are going to have a higher likelihood of developing schizophrenia? And we need to sort of think about that. And again, in the same study, it was shown that the raised rates of schizophrenia for Asian women, particularly among Pakistani women. Now, what does that mean? Again, it's a sort of intriguing finding. And consistently, it's confirmed these findings. Same findings emerge in Netherlands, in Denmark, and in the United States. In Netherlands, there have been several studies, fairly good methodologically, looking at Surinamese first generation, second generation 3 times, Moroccan first generation 5 times, second generation 7 times, Turkish second generation twice, Dutch Antilles again, relative risk twice compared. And similarly in Denmark and United States, African Americans have shown rates 3.27 times higher. Sweden, similarly, high rates. Migrants from Europe within Sweden, as well as Asia and Africa, show higher rates. Interestingly, in Israel, one study showed elevated rates in first and second generation groups marginally, but among Ethiopians, the rates go even higher up. So what is it that's going on? And since 1980s, we've been talking about the potential reasons, and these reasons indicate that is it when people migrate that we as clinicians do not understand their culture and therefore we tend to misdiagnose? Is there some kind of ethnic liability of diagnosis and of psychosis as well as schizophrenia? Is it possible, as I showed you earlier, that people who are vulnerable to schizophrenia are more likely to migrate because they're feeling restless and therefore more likely to move? Is it about some kind of obstetric complications? Is it the stress of migration? Or is it cannabis use and socioeconomic disadvantages? I don't think it is misdiagnosis. It's fairly clear. I've been involved in 3 studies in London, in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, and in Barbados and Trinidad, which showed us very clearly that the rates using the same instruments, using the same clinicians, rates of schizophrenia in the Caribbean are lower than those seen in African Caribbeans in the UK. Now that indicates that there's something else that's going on. We know that schizophrenia is a difficult diagnosis. There are diagnostic changes. It can be precipitated by crisis. Hallucinations and delusions are quite common, and delusions of persecution can be quite common. But what does it mean in terms of comparisons? And I think I'm going to come back to that. But this is a very interesting observation which shows that social factors, particularly socioeconomic disadvantage and stress of migration, are more likely to create schizophrenia. Cross-sectional survey of perceived discrimination, and I think it is quite interesting that Moroccans showed high levels of discrimination, not real discrimination, it's perception. How do people see me? And I think one of the major challenges in psychiatry is that in terms of identity and in terms of settling down, it's really important how you see me seeing you. So how the clinician or the employer or the large society sees an individual becomes a major factor. And it is, again, perceived discrimination shows high rates of deprivation, discrimination, and high rates of schizophrenia. So we looked at 4 possible additional hypotheses indicating ethnic variation. First one is ethnic density. The second one is about concepts of self. Who am I? What's my identity? Thirdly, it's about achievement and aspiration. What is it that I set out to achieve, and how much I achieved, and what the discrepancy between the two is. And lastly, it's about cultural congruity, and I'll come back to that. Ethnic density is being looked at, and there have been lots of studies, and it's been fairly mixed data. Some people have argued that ethnic density plays a role in high rates of schizophrenia. Others have argued that it does not. It is that risk is elevated if there are other individuals less from your ethnic minority less likely to be around you. So if you're living by yourself, there are not many people around you, you're more likely to develop schizophrenia. Again, it's sort of worth looking at. This is an interesting study, about 14 years old. Jane Boydell and colleagues looked at incidence of schizophrenia and mapped out onto various neighborhoods. But one of the things that they ignored, and I do believe that we need to look at very carefully, is that cultures have different ways of characterizing individuals. There are social-centric cultures which people are integrated into strong, cohesive in-groups which throughout their lifetime continue to protect them in exchange for unquestioning loyalty. And then there are individualistic or egocentric cultures where ties between individuals are very loose and everyone is expected to look after himself or herself and their immediate family. So egocentric cultures are about I, it's about autonomy, it's about emotional independence. Collectivist or social-centric cultures are about emotional interdependence, sharing duties and obligations, and need for stable and predetermined friendships, and making group decisions. And Geert Hofstede has written quite a lot about cultures having different dimensions. Egocentricity, social-centricity is one, but he also divides cultures into masculine and feminine. Cultures about orientation, long-term orientation as to how you see your role in life, but also he sees how close you feel to the center of power. So what that means in terms of individuals, and particularly in cultural congruity, is that you look at specifically, if you are a sociocentric individual from a sociocentric society migrating into an egocentric society, still with me? If you don't have sociocentric individuals around you in egocentric society, you're more likely to feel alienated, you're more likely to feel withdrawn, you're more likely to feel unsupported, and therefore you're quite likely to become isolated, perhaps psychotic, and certainly the evidence we showed in London was that African Caribbeans who live in places where they are living by themselves are more likely to be unemployed, more likely to be using cannabis. So it becomes a model where vulnerability to psychosis then gets influenced by cannabis and unemployment and other social factors. In the same study, we looked at achievement and aspiration, which showed that we measured aspiration in 5 areas: financial, educational, social, housing, employment, suggesting that if you leave your country or you pushed out of your country into another culture or another country, and you find that you wanted to work as a psychiatrist and you could not get a job and you're working as a waiter, there's a major discrepancy in your achievement. And what does it do to your self-image? What does it do to your self-esteem? And we found that particularly people who were well-educated, their discrepancy in achievement and aspiration was much greater. People can live in poor housing, people can cope with poor employment, but if you feel that you got high educational levels but you can't meet the standards that you'd set up, and again, 2 examples spring to mind. One is that in many countries, migrants who may be lawyers or professionals in their own country end up driving taxis because that's the easiest job. So what does it do to your ego? What does it do to your self-esteem? So leading on from that, and again I'm grateful to Professor Mai for giving us the opportunity for the WPA to develop guidance on managing mental health and mental health care for migrants and refugees, and particularly we were looking at 5 specific special groups. And again, Professor Mai earlier in his talk talked about mental health of children and adolescents, and I think it is absolutely critical in terms of public health intervention. One thing that we must do is about parenting skills. It is about how parents bring children up, what they do in the antenatal and immediate postnatal period. That's where the public health interventions need to be. And we know, particularly for women, if they're primary migrant, there are specific issues. If they're secondary migrant, there are other issues. And there are problems, particularly in many cultures, about gender roles and gender role expectations. Women are expected to find jobs, bring money, and yet when they come home, they're expected to do the cooking and the cleaning and the washing and look after their husbands and partners and so on and so forth. For children, again, one of the major challenges is physical abuse and sexual abuse, and again, Professor Mai talked about it earlier. Among migrants, certainly age dispute becomes a major issue in terms of adjustment, and that will affect the child's identity, which will affect particularly their awareness of who they are and their growth. And obviously being separated from parents or seasonal parental migration will cause problems. Again, for the elderly, there are specific issues post-migration, whether they are primary migrants or secondary migrants, or whether they come by themselves or as part of the family. And isolation, particularly, it's been shown increasingly that there's multiple jeopardy in ethnicity, age, and gender. We know about refugees, somebody who is being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular group, their sexual orientation, or political opinion. So they migrate, and we know that in many cultures, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender individuals would be discriminated against. It's also important, as I mentioned earlier, that this loss of the familiar, loss of attitudes, loss of values, loss of relationships can cause cultural bereavement. And cultural bereavement will affect cultural identity in the new society. And it's being described as something called a striped zebra, which is that there are two parallel identities, one original and one new one. And again, I can sort of identify with this because when I go to India, it takes me 10 days to get into what I call my Indian mode of thinking. Until then, I have very kind of British attitudes, British perceptions, and I get irritated by little things. But after 10 days, something happens to my brain, and I switch into my old identity within which I was brought up. So the recommendations for policymakers, service providers, and clinicians are that we need very clear policies for migration, for human rights, and we need adequate resources for services, particularly when people don't speak the language. Trying to understand their distress in their primary language becomes incredibly important. And therefore, we also need adequate resources for training, and there needs to be joined up working. Health should not be seen in isolation. Health, justice, education all come together. And again, as Professor Maya earlier talked about, we need to be looking at public education. For us as clinicians, we need to provide services which are easy to navigate. Most patients find it very difficult to understand why they are being referred to someone else, even from clinical services to social services to housing to employment. We need to be culturally sensitive, which is about good clinical practice. Services need to be both geographically and emotionally accessible. There needs to be some training in cultural competence. Whether we have culture brokers or cultural liaison officers, again, depends upon local resources. Any research must have both qualitative and quantitative components. Should we have specific services for migrants alone? I think that's a debate the profession needs to have. There are advantages and there are disadvantages. But what we do need is a very clear inclusion in the curriculum and as part of the training. To draw the relationship between migration and schizophrenia, migration and mental health to a close, there are very clear links with socioeconomic disadvantage. We know that mental health is affected by social determinants. Racial discrimination plays a role, whether it is direct racism or indirect in terms of controlling resources. I think the evidence that there are underlying biological factors is not as strong as I would like it to be. Is it about pre-morbid personality? Again, we don't know, but here is a challenge for Italy. If, as you're accepting more migrants, here is an opportunity, research-wise, to look at long-term outcomes, creating a case register, creating services where you can follow up individuals for a long time to see how things change, so you get much more prospective data rather than simply associations. And obviously, we need to do more work on achievement and expectation assessment and expectations, and also a relationship between cultures where migrants come from and cultures they migrate to, so it's sociocentric versus egocentric, and we need to look at social networks and social support systems. Once again, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much for your very kind and generous hospitality, and thank you for listening.